What really happened to Rose Harsent on that fog-drenched night in 1902? A quiet servant girl, a locked cottage, and a fire that was meant to erase everything. But instead, it exposed one of the most haunting unsolved murders in English history. In the early hours of June 1st, smoke rose from a lonely home behind the Peasenhall chapel. When neighbors arrived, they found Rose, just 23 years old, lying on the kitchen floor. Her throat had been cut. Her nightdress was soaked in blood, and someone had tried, desperately, to burn the house down around her. At first glance, it looked like a tragic crime of passion. But the deeper investigators dug, the more disturbing it became. Hidden letters, secret meetings, a rumored affair between Rose, a servant, and a respected church leader, in a village where appearances mattered more than truth. This was a scandal no one wanted to see unfold. The newspapers called it a Peasenhall mystery, a case that tore a community apart and left behind one burning question. Was Rose murdered to hide a secret, or to keep someone else's reputation safe? Over a century later, the evidence is gone. The suspects long buried, but the whispers remain. Because sometimes the most terrifying thing about a murder isn't who committed it, but how easily everyone else chose to forget. Before the headlines, before the rumors and courtroom whispers, Rose Harsent was simply a young woman trying to carve out a small, honest life in the quiet Suffolk village of Peasenhall, born in 1879 to George and Mary Harsent. Rose was one of 6 children raised in a working-class family. Life in rural England wasn't easy at the turn of the century. Wages were low, and opportunities for women were even lower. Like many girls her age, Rose went into domestic service. It wasn't glamorous, but it offered room, board, and the faint promise of independence. Those who knew her described her as a bright and gentle girl, someone who took pride in her work and rarely caused trouble. She wasn't the sort to cross anyone, one neighbor later recalled. Always polite, always quiet. Rose attended the local Primitive Methodist chapel regularly, a small, close-knit congregation that formed the social backbone of Peasenhall. It was there that she met William Gardner, a well-respected figure in the church and a man nearly twice her age. At first, their connection seemed harmless. Gardner was married with 6 children, but in a village that thrived on gossip, even a kind word could fuel suspicion. And in Rose's case, whispers quickly began to spread. Some claimed she and Gardner had been seen together after dark. Others said she had confided in a friend that she was frightened, that she might be expecting a child. No one knows for sure what passed between them, but the balance of power was clear. Gardner was a man of standing. Rose was a servant alone and vulnerable. In an era where a woman's reputation could be destroyed by rumor alone, even an accusation could mean social ruin. Yet despite everything, Rose seemed determined to hold on to a semblance of normalcy. She kept to her duties, worked long hours, and remained at her post in the cottage behind the chapel. It was small, isolated, and surrounded by fields, the kind of place that looked peaceful in daylight, but felt eerily silent once night fell. Friends remembered her as a bit of a dreamer. She loved to sing, to write letters, and to read whenever she could. One friend said she often spoke of wanting more from life, perhaps to leave the village, to find work in the city, or even to marry one day, but underneath her quiet demeanor there was an unease. Some said she'd grown withdrawn in the weeks before her death, avoiding eye contact and moving through her gaze, as if weighed down by something unseen. She looked worried, another acquaintance recalled, like she was keeping a secret she couldn't tell anyone. Whether out of fear or shame, Rose didn't confide in her family. When her father last saw her, he said she seemed distracted, but said nothing of what was troubling her. In the rigid moral world of 1902, to admit to scandal, or even to vulnerability, could mean the end of a woman's livelihood. That's what makes her story so haunting. Rose wasn't extraordinary by society's standards. She wasn't powerful or wealthy or infamous. She was ordinary, and maybe that's what makes her fate resonate even more. Because in many ways, she could have been anyone. She was a young woman trying to navigate a world that offered her little protection and even less understanding. And yet, she somehow became the center of one of the most enduring mysteries of Edwardian England. It's easy to look back now and wonder if anyone could have saved her, if someone had listened, or believed her fears, or seen the danger she might have been in. But perhaps that's part of what makes the story of Rose Harsent so tragic. She wasn't just a name in an old police report. She was a life interrupted, and in Peasenhall, that interruption still echoes like a whisper carried on the wind. The day began like any other in Peasenhall shop's opening. Hens scattered in the yards, the chapel bell calling people to evening prayers. But as evening fell, on May 31st, and slid into the small hours of June 1st, something in the pattern of the village changed. For those not there, it's hard to explain how ordinary detail becomes part of a darker design. The way a lantern is left burning too long. The way a footstep lingers outside a window. The moment a letter is folded and tucked away with hands that tremble. Rose worked late that night, as she often did, tending to chores in the little cottage behind the chapel. Neighbors later remembered seeing a light in her window well after most houses were dark. Some said she had gone to bed early. Others claimed she was restless, walking the floor, listening at the door. These small contradictions matter because they are the threads a later reconstruction must try to knit together. Around midnight, someone noticed smoke. Accounts differ on who first saw it. Some say it was a passerby on his way home, a man who glanced up and saw the faint orange through the cracks of the cottage. Others insist it was a neighbor who smelled the tongue of burning cloth on the air. Whatever the first detection, the alarm spread quickly. Lanterns were raised, doors thrust open, and men hurried down the lane toward the chapel's outbuildings. When they forced the door, the scene that met them was chaotic and terrible. Smoke curled across the low ceiling, and the floor was slick with something darker than water. Rose lay prone, motionless, between the hearth and the table. Her nightdress was stained, and there were marks that suggested a struggle. The paraffin later identified by investigators had been poured across the floor and set alight, not merely to start a blaze, but as the coroner would put it, to destroy what might reveal the truth. It was an attempt at erasure. Neighbors tried, by hand and bucket, to control the flame. One man ran for the constable, another for the vicar. In those frantic minutes, the village was both rescue and jury crowds murmuring, faces lit by lantern glow, the dreadful silence of people confronted with violence in a place meant for peace. It's the kind of scene that lodges in memory, the tilt of a body, the glint of broken glass, a letter scorched at the corner as if it had been used to smother evidence. As constables arrived and took charge, testimony began to diverge. Some swore they had heard raised voices earlier that evening near the chapel yard. Others insisted they had seen Gardner, the church leader, enter the back of the cottage at dusk. Gardner himself later admitted to visiting the premises on the night in question, but maintained he left long before the disaster. His account, precise and calm, contradicted others who remembered seeing him linger. There were whispers of letters' notes found hidden, some unburned, others charred at the edges. People spoke in hushed tones about secret meetings and furtive glances. One witness claimed Rose had been seen arguing with an unknown man by the lane. Another claimed she had been received by Gardner and left in tears. Which account was true? Which was paling memory, and which was purposeful misdirection? Could anyone have predicted that a series of small, private acts would snowball into this public catastrophe? The forensics of the day were rudimentary. Investigators noted the cut throat, the placement of the fire, the scattered domestic items. They cataloged the letters they could recover and took statements from neighbors who could not agree on a single timeline. And always, threaded through the official notes, were the quieter observations, Rose's silence in those final days, her sudden withdrawal, the look of worry her father had noticed when they last spoke. By dawn, the cottage was under a tarp, and the street outside hummed with anxious speculation. People asked one another, who could do such a thing? Why would someone try to burn a house and leave a body behind? And painfully, had anyone seen signs that could have prevented it? The immediate answers were messy, contradictory, full of accusation and defensive denial. It is here, at the raw, confusing intersection of the private and the public that the case takes on its haunting quality. A single night became a mirror reflecting not only a single death, but the tangled social pressures that made that night possible. And as the village scrambled for explanations, the most unsettling question lingered. Did the events of that evening spring from a single hand, or from 1,000 small choices and shared silences that together allowed violence to flourish? When the first rays of sunlight stretched across the rooftops of Peasenhall on June 1st, 1902, they illuminated a village that would never quite feel safe again. The cottage behind the chapel was blackened, the door still hanging crooked from where rescuers had forced it open. The smell of smoke and paraffin lingered in the morning air, heavy, metallic, and unforgettable. News spread faster than the fire itself had, carried by trembling voices and hurried footsteps. By mid-morning, everyone in the village knew. Rose Harsent was dead. It was Constable Alfred Last who officially took charge of the scene. He arrived to find villagers gathered in clusters, whispering, gesturing toward the smoldering ruins of the cottage. Some wept openly, others crossed themselves and turned away. Inside, the sight was grim. Rose's body had been laid on a table, covered with a sheet. The fire had scorched the walls and ceiling, but had failed to destroy the most telling evidence, and, tragically, her remains. The constable noted the gash across her throat, the scattered household items, the signs of disturbance. This wasn't an accident. This was deliberate. By early afternoon, Inspector William Wybrow from the Suffolk Constabulary had arrived to assist. He began what would become one of the most exhaustive investigations of its time. The small team of officers marked every inch of the cottage. They found a paraffin can, half full, near the hearth, a broken lamp, its glass blackened with soot, and near the edge of the table, a partially burnt letter addressed R.H. in a man's hand. That letter, investigators would later learn, might have been the spark that set this entire tragedy into motion. The inquest began within days. The coroner's report was clinical but chilling. The wound upon the neck is consistent with deliberate force, the kind that requires intent. The medical examiner noted that the fire had been started after death. Someone had murdered Rose and then tried to erase her. As word of the murder spread, Peasenhall, a village once defined by its quiet piety, became consumed by gossip, fear, and speculation. People whispered behind curtains, pointing fingers and drawing their own conclusions. Church services turned tense. The congregation that had once gathered in harmony now sat in uneasy silence, eyes darting toward one man in particular, William Gardner, the local church leader, who had been rumored to have an improper connection with Rose. Gardner denied it all, of course. He was a respectable man, a husband, a father, a deacon. But villagers remembered the letters. Some said Rose had confided in a friend about a secret relationship. Others insisted she'd been terrified of being discovered. They said she looked nervous, one witness later testified, as if someone was watching her, even when she thought she was alone. Meanwhile, the police were caught between theory and evidence. They questioned nearly everyone who had crossed paths with Rose in the days before her death. Each interview revealed more layers of deceit, of jealousy, of fear. A milkman claimed he'd seen a man lurking near the chapel that night. Another witness spoke of a shadow moving quickly past the lane just before midnight. But the fog that had rolled in that night, thick and unyielding, had obscured everything, even the truth. The deeper the investigation went, the more the town fractured. Families stopped speaking. Friends turned on one another. The chapel, once the moral center of Peasenhall, became a place of hushed accusation. The town that once felt safe, one villager wrote in a letter to a relative, is now cloaked in fear. We sleep with our doors bolted, and every creak feels like a warning. Police efforts intensified. Officers scoured the nearby fields and woods for clues, anything that could point to the murderer. They found footprints, a discarded handkerchief, and traces of paraffin outside the back door. Each piece added intrigue, but not clarity. The press descended upon the village, their headlines sensational. Servant girl slain in chapel fire. Deacon under suspicion in Peasenhall mystery. Reporters described Peasenhall as a place gripped by ghostly unease, where every whispered rumor carried the weight of a confession. For the locals, it was suffocating. They had lost one of their own, and now the outside world treated their grief as spectacle. Rose's funeral was held days later at St. Michael's Church. Her coffin was plain pine, carried by neighbors who could barely meet each other's eyes. The service was quiet, but not peaceful. Even the hymns seemed strained. People came to mourn her, yes, but also to search one another's faces for guilt. As the constables packed up their notes that evening, one turned to the other and asked, "Do you think we'll ever really know who did it?" The senior officer hesitated, then replied, "Maybe, but knowing and proving aren't the same thing." That sentence seemed to hang over the investigation and the village for years to come, because although the police had suspects, the evidence was murky, and every new discovery raised more questions than it answered. Who had visited Rose that night? Why had the fire been set so carelessly if its purpose was concealment? And if this truly was about love or betrayal, why did it end in such brutality? The murder of Rose Harsent had shattered Peasenhall's fragile peace. What had once been a simple country village was now a landscape of suspicion and shadows. And as the authorities prepared to announce their findings, one thing became chillingly clear. This wasn't just a murder. It was a mirror held up to a society built on secrecy, pride, and the desperate need to protect appearances at any cost. The investigation into the murder of Rose Harsent would become one of the most debated criminal cases in Edwardian England, a case that revealed not only the brutality of one act, but also the fragility of truth in a small, God-fearing village. It began with a simple question: who would want to harm a quiet, 23-year-old servant girl? But as the evidence emerged, that question became more tangled, leading investigators down a path of secrecy, betrayal, and scandal. When Inspector William Wybrow began his inquiries, he already sensed this was not an ordinary case. There was no sign of forced entry into Rose's cottage, suggesting that her killer was someone she trusted. The fire, hastily set with paraffin, seemed more an act of desperation than of calculation. And then there were the letters, fragments of correspondence between Rose and one William Gardner, a respected church deacon and family man who lived just across the field. Gardner was 46, married with 6 children, and known throughout Peasenhall as a man of principle. He led hymns in the chapel and kept strict moral standards. But when police examined Rose's belongings, they found evidence of a secret connection. A half-burnt letter, written in a firm, deliberate hand, appeared to arrange a meeting on the very night she died. The letter's tone was cautious, urgent. "Meet me after dark, as we agreed. I will come by the back way." When confronted, Gardner denied writing it. He admitted knowing Rose, yes, but only in the context of church work. He insisted he had gone to bed at 10 o'clock that evening and hadn't left his house again. His wife, Mrs. Gardner, corroborated his story, though she hesitated when pressed about the exact time he'd returned home. Still, the suspicion grew. Witnesses recalled seeing a man near the chapel around midnight. One even claimed to recognize Gardner's distinct gait, but others disagreed, arguing the fog that night was too thick for anyone to be certain. Police, however, could not ignore the pattern that began to form. Rose had reportedly told a friend months earlier that she was in trouble, a euphemism, at the time, for pregnancy. She was unmarried. Gardner was the only man with whom she'd been seen alone. Rumors began to circulate that Rose had threatened to expose him, and that the meeting that night was meant to discuss her condition. The theory was simple. If grim, perhaps Gardner had gone to the cottage to persuade Rose to stay silent. Perhaps the conversation escalated, and perhaps, in that desperate moment, a life was taken and a fire was set to erase the evidence. But other theories soon emerged, muddying the waters. One involved a local laborer named George J., who had occasionally quarreled with Rose over gossip spread about her in the village. Some suggested he had motive and opportunity, but Jay had a firm alibi. He'd been drinking at a nearby pub that night, a fact confirmed by multiple witnesses. Another theory pointed to a traveling salesman seen near Peasenhall in the days before the murder, but no solid link was ever found. The more police dug, the more the case seemed to circle back to Gardner. His reputation, once spotless, began to crumble under the weight of innuendo. Newspapers across Suffolk printed sensational headlines about the deacon and the dead servant. Crowds gathered outside his home, whispering, watching. Inside, his wife remained steadfast, publicly defending him, even as her eyes betrayed unease. Investigators searched Gardner's home, seizing his clothing and boots. They found a faint smear of blood on his shirt cuff, though he claimed it was from slaughtering a pig days earlier. They also noted traces of paraffin on his hands. But paraffin was common in nearly every home. It fueled lamps, cleaned tools, kept the cold at bay. Was it incriminating, or just ordinary? Then came the most damning discovery of all, a witness statement from a postman who swore he had delivered a letter from Gardner to Rose on May 31st, the very day of her death. Gardner denied sending it. Yet his handwriting, according to experts, bore a striking resemblance to that found on the half-burnt note in her cottage. With mounting pressure, Gardner was finally arrested and charged with murder. The village erupted, half in outrage, half in disbelief. The idea that a respected deacon could commit such an act was almost unthinkable. And yet, the pieces seemed to fit too neatly to ignore. But even then, cracks appeared in the case. There were no eyewitnesses, no weapon, no clear physical link tying Gardner to the scene. The fire had destroyed most forensic traces, and the science of fingerprinting was still in its infancy. It was a case built on circumstantial evidence, whispers, and moral outrage rather than certainty. At the coroner's inquest, one juror whispered to another, "If he did it, God will know. But we may never prove it." And that became the haunting truth of the Peasenhall murder, a story suspended between guilt and doubt. Gardner maintained his innocence to the end. "I have sinned," he told one interviewer quietly, "but not in this way." It was an ambiguous statement, one that set imaginations racing. Had he sinned through adultery, through silence, or through something darker? The question lingered like fog over the fields that had seen Rose's last night. Even among police officers, opinions were divided. Some swore Gardner's guilt was obvious. Others, after months of chasing leads that went nowhere, began to wonder whether the real killer had slipped quietly through the cracks of that darkened night. Never to be found, but the question still lingered. Did the evidence truly point to him? Or had the town, desperate for order in the face of horror, simply chosen the most convenient villain? The investigation had unearthed enough to accuse, but not enough to convict, and in that space between suspicion and proof, the mystery of Rose Harsent only deepened. When William Gardner finally stood trial for the murder of Rose Harsent, the nation's eyes turned toward the small Suffolk village of Peasenhall. What had once been a local scandal now became a national obsession, a story that spilled across newspaper headlines and dinner table discussions alike. It was a story of hypocrisy and sin, of a man of God accused of the unthinkable. And perhaps, more than anything else, it was a story about how fragile reputations could be when truth refused to stay buried. The trial opened in November of 1902 at the Ipswich Assizes. The courtroom was packed to capacity, the air thick with anticipation and gossip. Women clutched their shawls tightly. Men leaned forward, waiting for each new revelation. On one side sat the prosecution, armed with the damning fragments of letters, the testimonies of neighbors, and the shadow of Rose's tragedy. On the other sat Gardner, calm, almost eerily so, flanked by his wife, who refused to leave his side. The prosecution's argument was clear and relentless. Gardner had been entangled in a secret affair with Rose, and when she threatened to expose him, he silenced her. They claimed the letters proved their relationship, that the note found in the cottage arranged the fatal meeting, and that the fire was a clumsy attempt to hide his crime. Every word was punctuated with moral weight. Not just that he killed, but that he betrayed his own pulpit. The defense countered with equal vigor. They pointed out the lack of physical evidence. No murder weapon, no eyewitnesses, no direct link between Gardner and the crime scene. The so-called confession letter, they argued, was nothing more than gossip turned into handwriting speculation. And the fire? It could just as easily have been set by someone else trying to destroy evidence or confuse the investigation. For every accusation, the defense produced a doubt. And in a courtroom built on uncertainty, doubt could be deadly or liberating. Still, the weight of public opinion pressed heavily against Gardner. The press had already convicted him long before the jury deliberated. Newspapers portrayed him as the fallen churchman, the wolf in the fold. The Daily Mail ran headlines like, "Deacon of Darkness. Was it love, lust, or fear that drove him?" Others published lurid sketches of Rose's cottage in flames, her name scrawled in Gothic typeface beneath. What the papers didn't print, or didn't care to, were the subtler truths. The quiet testimonies of those who doubted his guilt. The inconsistencies in the timelines. The fact that Rose herself had been the subject of malicious rumors long before her death. She had been a working-class woman, unmarried, rumored to be pregnant. Society didn't treat women like her kindly in life, and it didn't defend them in death. Perhaps what shocked people most, one reporter later wrote, wasn't just the crime, but what it revealed about society at the time. This case wasn't only about one man's guilt, it was about the collision of class, gender, and religion in a world that valued appearances above truth. Rose was a servant. Gardner was a deacon. Their lives were never meant to intersect. And yet, they did, and in that intersection lay both tragedy and condemnation. The jury deliberated for 11 hours before announcing their decision. They could not agree. The case ended in a hung jury, and Gardner was released, but not cleared. A retrial was ordered the following year, in 1903, with the same evidence and the same doubts. Once again, the jury was divided. It was unprecedented. 2 trials, 2 hung juries. The Crown finally conceded defeat. William Gardner was never tried again. Legally, he walked free. But in the court of public opinion, he was never acquitted. The shadow of suspicion clung to him like smoke long after the fires of the courtroom dimmed. After his release, Gardner returned to Peasenhall. But the man who once led hymns now found doors closed and eyes averted. Parishioners avoided him. Former friends whispered in the pews. Even his children, some said, grew up under the weight of a name that had become synonymous with scandal. Gardner lived quietly until his death in 1941, never confessing, never convicted, and never forgiven. For the newspapers, the case had already served its purpose. It sold copies, filled columns, and fed the public's fascination with moral downfall. The Illustrated Police News continued to reprint sketches of the murder scene for years, branding Rose's story as a cautionary tale, one that blurred the line between tragedy and entertainment. And yet, beneath the sensationalism, there was something more haunting. It wasn't just about whether Gardner had killed Rose. It was about how quickly a community that prided itself on faith could turn to judgment, and how little it took for a young woman's life to become a symbol rather than a story. The Peasenhall case left no heroes, no closure, only questions. Did a man of God commit a mortal sin and escape punishment? Or did an innocent man become the victim of moral panic, sacrificed to preserve the illusion of purity in a place already stained by guilt? In the end, the law had spoken. Twice, but neither verdict satisfied the world that watched. The murder of Rose Harsent had become more than a crime. It had become a reflection of the times themselves, a world where truth was often less important than the appearance of righteousness. And as the public turned the page, moving on to the next scandal, Peasenhall remained suspended between certainty and doubt, a village forever haunted by the question it could never truly answer. For over a century, the murder of Rose Harsent has remained one of England's most unsettling unsolved crimes, a haunting story of passion, betrayal, and justice that never quite arrived. The official records are closed, the witnesses long gone, and yet the case refuses to rest. Each generation that rediscovers it finds themselves asking the same question that Peasenhall once whispered: who really killed Rose Harsent? After the second hung jury in 1903, William Gardner walked free, never to face trial again. But freedom didn't peace. In the eyes of the villagers, he was still the man who had met Rose on that fatal night, still the one whose shadow loomed over the charred remains of her cottage. Yet, despite all the suspicion, not a single new piece of evidence ever surfaced. The years turned into decades. The fields around Peasenhall grew quiet again. But Rose's name never truly vanished. It lingered in the corners of local memory, retold in hushed tones at pubs, in old parish records, and eventually in true crime books and television documentaries that kept the story alive. What makes this case so compelling, even today, is the sheer ambiguity that hangs over every piece of evidence. The letter that summoned Rose to her death, was it truly written by Gardner? Handwriting experts of the time were divided, and modern analysts, revisiting the scans, remain equally unconvinced. Some argue it was his writing disguised, while others insist it was a cruel imitation designed to destroy him. Then there's the matter of the fire. Investigators concluded that the fire was deliberately set, but by whom? Some theorized it was Gardner attempting to cover his tracks. Others believed Rose may have accidentally started it herself, perhaps while trying to light a lamp in the darkness, though that theory never explained the stab wounds or the brutality she suffered before the flames rose. Even Rose's pregnancy, long considered the emotional core of the case, remains uncertain. Early reports claimed she was 6 months along, fueling theories that Gardner was the father. Yet later medical records suggested it might have been a misinterpretation of the autopsy, or even the product of sensational journalism meant to inflame public outrage. Could someone else have been responsible? Over the years, a number of alternative theories have emerged. One suggests that a jealous local man, perhaps another suitor, could have discovered Rose's relationship with Gardner and acted out of rage or revenge. Another points toward a cover-up, where someone from the church or the village elite silenced Rose to protect the community's reputation. After all, a scandal involving a married church deacon and a servant girl could ruin more than one life. It could unravel the moral fabric of the entire parish. But there's also a darker, lonelier possibility that no one ever really knew the full truth. Perhaps Rose went to meet Gardner that night, and something went terribly wrong. Perhaps it wasn't premeditated at all, but a moment of fear and chaos that spiraled into tragedy. And when it was over, someone, maybe Gardner, maybe not, struck a match to hide what couldn't be undone. Modern criminologists who've studied the Peasenhall case often call it a perfect storm of lost evidence. The cottage was burned, the scene contaminated, and early 20th century forensic science simply wasn't capable of separating fact from rumor. Even today, no definitive forensic trace ties anyone to the crime. And yet, despite all logic, the suspicion never faded. When Gardner died in 1941, some locals still believed he had gotten away with murder. Others said he had suffered enough, condemned not by law, but by the weight of accusation. His grave, in a quiet Suffolk cemetery, remains unmarked, as if even death couldn't wash away the doubt. Rose's final resting place, meanwhile, lies in a modest churchyard in Darsham. Her headstone reads simply, "In loving memory of Rose Harsent, died June 1st, 1902, aged 23 years. Nothing on it hints at the horror she endured. No mention of fire, betrayal, or blood. Just a name, a date, and silence. But for those who visit, it's impossible not to feel the chill of unanswered questions drifting through the countryside. Over the decades, writers, historians, and even amateur sleuths have revisited the Peasenhall murder, trying to find something everyone else missed. A hidden clue, a lost confession. But every path leads back to the same dead end, the same uncertain space where evidence dissolves into speculation, and speculation into legend. In many ways, that's what makes the story endure. It isn't just about who did it, but what the mystery reveals about human nature. How quickly morality can blur when fear and desire collide, and how easily justice can lose its way when the truth lies tangled in the smoke. Even now, more than 100 years later, Peasenhall remains a quiet village. The cottages stand where they always have, the same roads winding through the fields. But on certain misty evenings, locals say, if you walk past the place where Rose's home once stood, you can still smell a faint trace of smoke in the air, a ghostly reminder of a life taken too soon, and a truth buried too deep. And so, decades later, the truth remains just out of reach, suspended in time, between innocence and guilt, between justice and mystery. The Peasenhall murder may have faded from headlines, but it has never truly left the minds of those who hear it. Because somewhere, hidden in that quiet village, the real story of what happened to Rose Harsent still waits to be found. And so, more than a century later, the story of Rose Harsent still lingers, not as a neatly solved crime, but as a haunting reminder of how fragile truth can be. Her name may have faded from the headlines, but her silence still echoes through the misty lanes of Peasenhall, where a young woman's final steps remain etched in shadow. Perhaps that's what makes this case so unforgettable. Not just the tragedy itself, but the uncertainty that time could never erase. Who wrote the letter? Who struck the match? And who, even now, carries the secret of that terrible night? We may never know. But stories like Rose's remind us that behind every unsolved mystery lies a real human being, someone whose voice was silenced too soon. Have you heard of this case before? What do you think really happened to Rose Harsent? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you'd like to hear more quiet, haunting investigations into forgotten crimes, consider subscribing. Every story we revisit brings us a little closer to understanding the darkness that lingers just beyond the edge of history. Until next time, stay curious, stay safe, and thank you for watching.